In this video you will find out how the Soviet Union killed the million of Ukrainians, what the Holodomor is, why is this crime considered genocide, and how is the famine connected with the Russia's modern war against Ukraine. I'm Igor from Ukraine, let's go.
Тікай звідси, а то спіймають і зварять.
А вас?
І мене зварять, якщо знайдуть.
Дід, то чума забралась?
Ні, синку, то не чума. То государство.
So what is the Holodomor? Holodomor is a famine, a complete lack of food, because of which people died from hunger. The Holodomor of 1932-1933 was an act of the genocide organized by the leader of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, by creating an artificial famine with the aim to destroy Ukrainians, the final elimination of Ukrainian resistance to the regime, and the efforts of Ukrainians to build an independent country, independent of Moscow. To understand the causes of the Holodomor, let's go back in the USSR in 1928. Formally, the USSR is a union of several national republics. In practice, one-party dictatorship with the centralization in the Moscow. In 1928, the USSR announced a course of collectivization. Collectivization of agriculture in the USSR was a creation of large collective farms based on the peasant farms. It was assumed that the result of the collectivization would increase an economy and agriculture products to 150%. But the actual goal of collectivization was to transform the entire labor force of villages as well as cities into workers of state enterprises. This made it possible to establish a full economic control of the authorities over the citizens. That is, to implement in practice the idea of a dictatorship of the authorities over the entire country, where peasants made up more than 85% of the population. It was known that the implementation of this plan would meet some resistance, and government understood this. The Soviet government didn't care about their people. They only needed to increase their economy. People were robbed of their lands, forced to work in collective farms for the state as slaves, and those who resisted were killed. Also, for the fastest growth of the economy of the Soviet Union, 5-year plans were introduced. What is a 5-year plan? That is a certain plan for development of the economy, technology, science and education in the USSR for the 5 years. It sounds good, the country is developing, but now I'll tell you how it was in reality. Propaganda slogans, 5-year plan in 4 years, began to appear. I translated it. In the cities, people were forced to work excessively, and people suffered from lack of energy. And in the villages, people in collective farms made bread and had to give most of it to the authorities. But of the Ukrainian peasants, Stalin needed the most of bread because our land is fertile. So what is known so far? People were forced to work hard for the state, land, houses, livestock were taken away. They were forced to join collective farms. And now we are approaching to the terrible year of 1932. The Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932-33 was not a phenomenon of natural or social origin, as initially claimed by Soviet and later pro-Russian historians. Death due to hunger was the result of purposely applied terror by totalitarian authorities, i.e. genocide. It became the punishment of Ukrainians to their opposition for the collectivization and unwillingness to be under power of Russia. This punishment was carried out by destroying Ukrainian culture, language and traditions. By means of an artificially organized famine, the Soviet authorities tried to exterminate Ukrainians on Stalin's order. According to historians, at the beginning of the 30s of the 20th century, the Ukrainian village was the main center of resistance to the Soviet policy of collectivization. More than 4,000 protests took place in Ukraine, with the participation of about 1.2 million people. 41,000 peasants left the collective farms, and about 500 village councils refused to accept unrealistic plans for delivery of bread. Stalin was afraid of losing Ukraine as a resource, without which building a powerful industrial empire capable of conquering the world would remain only a dream. Not wanting to lose Ukraine, the Soviet regime built a plan to exterminate part of the Ukrainians, who always protested and don't want to be dependent on Russia, or Soviet Union is the same. A plan was disguised as plans to hand over bread to the state. It involved the complete seizure of all grain stocks, followed by the confiscation of other foodstuffs and property as fines for failure to comply with the bread delivery plan. Having turned Ukraine as a territory of mass starvation, the regime blocked all ways to salvation. The starving people were isolated. For this purpose, the regime of black boards and the prohibition of hunger strikers to leave Ukraine were applied. In the newspapers of that time, lists of villages were published, which were written on blackboards. Collective farms and villages listed on the blackboards were surrounded by military and armed men. All food supplies were taken away from this place. Trade and import of any goods were prohibited. 22.4 million people were physically blocked within the territory of Holodomor. People from whom all food was taken wanted to run away from a village, to find food anywhere, but people were shot for it. I don't know about you, but I was most moved about the following shots. When people were just going crazy from hunger, they didn't know what to do, and they knew that the city was surrounded by military, but they still ran because death by bullet was better.
Давай пулемет. Сюди! Борошно для діточок! Сипте! Сюди!
Another component of the genocide was the deliberate blocking of information about the famine. In January 1933, the Soviet authorities announced that there is no famine in Ukraine and all USSR. Stalin regime declared famine in Ukraine a non-existent phenomenon, and on this basis refused the help offered by numerous organizations, in particular Ukrainian communities abroad and the National Red Cross. Stalin, who considered the peasantry to be the basis of the national movement, attacked Ukrainian peasants as carriers of Ukrainian tradition, culture and language. An unrealistic production plan of 356 million puts of bread was set for Ukraine. In fact, these were actions to exterminate Ukrainians who always fought for their independence, protested, wanted to be left alone, but unfortunately it wasn't profitable for certain Stalin. And he decided to kill millions of people in the most terrible way. How it all happened? The Soviet police came to every peasant's house and began to search absolutely every corner of yard and house. They took everything and disappeared. This is a moment from the movie Holodomor 33.
Чого дивишся? Показуй, де ваш хліб.
Так і даєте хліб чи ні? Давай, давай.
You can see how the police poke sticks in the hay to check if there is any hidden food.
Отдайте харчі! Отдайте харчі! Що вас така година?
Відчепіться!
In the spring of 1933, mortality in Ukraine reached catastrophic proportions. The peak of the Holodomor was in June. At the time, approximately 28,000 people died every day, 1,200 every hour, and 20 every minute. Witnesses of the Holodomor tell about cases when peasants driven to despair ate the bodies of their own neighbors' children. It's hard to imagine, and I really don't want to think about that. It was one of the most terrible periods in Ukrainian history, and maybe in the mankind history. And you will be surprised, but in 20th century there were 3 famines in Ukraine. 3 times the Soviet, that is the Russian government, tried to exterminate Ukrainians and take the territory for themselves. Murder by starvation, propaganda that Nazis there is in Ukraine, and so on. Just think about how freedom-loving Ukrainians are. I hate the USSR because my ancestors survived the famine, and my grandmother, who lives in the Sumy region, told me really scary stories about Holodomor. I think it's a topic of separate video. During these 17 months of famine, more than 7 million people were killed in Ukraine, and 3 million Ukrainians outside its borders. The real figures of the dead were suppressed, which is confirmed by the order given by the authorities not to register the death of children under the age of 1 year. Ukrainians between the ages of 6 months and 17 years accounted the half of all Holodomor victims. Just only think about that. In this regard, the average life expectancy of Ukrainians in 1933 was 7.3 years for men and 10.9 years for women. In the entire history of mankind, such indicators have not been recorded anywhere. That is, the Holodomor in Ukraine became a social and humanitarian catastrophe of global scale. You can hear now there is air alarm in Ukraine while I am making a video, but it's okay. I want to make a video. Okay, let's continue. The consequence of the crime of genocide, in addition to the physical killing of millions of people, was the destruction of the traditional Ukrainian way of life. Famine became a weapon of mass biological destruction of Ukrainians, disrupted the genetic fund of the people for many decades, led to moral and psychological changes in the consciousness of Ukrainians. Traditional culture and folk customs have undergone deformation. For dozens of years, Ukrainian peasants were reduced to the status of disenfranchised collective farm workers, deprived of passports and pensions. Psychological consequences of the Holodomor were feelings of guilt and shame. People felt guilty for not being able to save their loved ones, shame for the immoral acts that were committed for the sake of survival. With the weakening of communist control over the public life in Ukraine, in the second half of the 1980s, the memory of the Holodomor is being revived. Since 1993, Ukraine has been commemorating the innocent victims of the Holodomor at the state level. And this is one more story about large communist state. It's a story about journalist Gareth Jones. Gareth Jones was a Welsh journalist first reported in the Western world without equivocation and under his own name the existence of the Soviet famine. Jones had reported anonymously in the Times in 1931 on starvation in Soviet Ukraine, and after his third visit to the Soviet Union, issued a press release under his own name in Berlin describing the widespread famine in detail. After being banned from re-entering the Soviet Union, Jones was kidnapped and murdered while investigating in Japanese-occupied Mongolia. His murder was likely committed by secret police in the Soviet Union, NKVD. And now I want to read you one of the many notes in his notebook. I walked alone through villages and 12 collective farms. Everywhere was the cry, "There is no bread, we are dying." For the fact that this person told the whole world the truth, in Kyiv the government is planning to install Gareth Johnson Street. History is cyclical, and now, instead of starvation, Russian Federation uses rockets to kill Ukrainians. But we will not kneel before anyone, and to the last Ukrainian killed, we will fight. Our freedom comes first. And that's it. I tried to tell you everything what I know about the famine. Please consider subscribing to my channel, hitting the bell icon and liking this video, because, you know, for me it's really motivation. You know that most bloggers turn off notification about subscription, like, etc. But I don't, because for me it's real big dose motivation to do more videos. And also it's just uplifting. Thank you for watching. Have a great time.